It is July 1540. In England, anticipation lingers as history recalls two women whose fates were bound to the same ruthless king: Anne of Cleves of Germany and Catherine Howard of England. Each stepped into the perilous world of Tudor royalty, navigating ambition, betrayal, and survival in a court where a crown could be both a blessing and a death sentence. Let us begin with the first, Anne of Cleves. Anne of Cleves was born on the 28th of June in the year 1515 in Dusseldorf, a city within the Duchy of Borg in the Holy Roman Empire. What happened to this quiet daughter of German nobility, chosen to become Queen of England? How did a woman with no command of English and little courtly training manage to win the favor of a dangerous king, even after their marriage failed? What gave her the wisdom to survive where others perished? Anne of Cleves entered history not by force but by fate. The death of her father, Duke John III of Cleves, set into motion a chain of political decisions that led her brother William to offer her hand in marriage to England's King Henry VIII. The alliance promised strength for both realms, especially as Protestant leaders faced pressure from powerful Catholic rulers. Anne, raised with a modest education, was thrust into this grand scheme not by ambition, but by duty. When the celebrated artist Hans Holbein the Younger was dispatched to paint her likeness, Anne's future was unknowingly sealed. It was this portrait, more than her presence or voice, that introduced her to a king desperately in need of a queen. Anne of Cleves was born into the powerful house of Lamarck, a family deeply rooted in the noble lands of Western Germany. Her father, Duke John III of Jülich-Cleves-Borg, was a progressive ruler who embraced moderate reforms during the early Reformation. Her mother, Maria of Jülich-Borg, came from a devout Catholic lineage. This mixture of Protestant openness and Catholic tradition shaped Anne's upbringing in subtle but important ways. She spent her early years at Schloss Borg, a large hilltop fortress overlooking the city of Solingen. It was here that Anne was raised in a relatively simple and traditional environment compared to the glittering courts of France or England. She was taught how to sew, manage a household, and display proper decorum, all valuable skills for a noblewoman, though far from the polished courtly training expected of an English queen. Unlike her future husband's other wives, Anne received no formal education in Latin, music, or politics. She could read and write in German, but had no knowledge of other languages. Still, those who knew her described her as mild-tempered, courteous, and obedient, virtues prized among the nobility. Anne was the second daughter in a politically active family. Her older sister, Sybil, was married to John Frederick, Elector of Saxony, a leader among German Protestants. These family ties placed Anne at the center of Europe's religious and political currents, even before she ever set foot in England. Her childhood prepared her to obey, to endure, and above all, to adapt. At the age of just 11, Anne of Cleves was drawn into the complicated world of dynastic matchmaking. In the year 1527, she was formally betrothed to Francis, the young son and heir of Antoine, Duke of Lorraine. At only 9 years old, Francis was still a child, and their union, while ceremonially agreed upon, was never legally binding. This proposed marriage was part of the wider European custom of sealing alliances through early betrothals, often involving noble children who barely knew one another. The arrangement with the House of Lorraine promised to link Anne's family with another major player in the shifting landscape of German and French politics. However, because Francis had not yet reached the age of consent, the agreement remained provisional. By the year 1535, the engagement was formally cancelled. The dissolution came as Francis grew older and political needs changed. France and the Holy Roman Empire were constantly adjusting their allegiances, and Anne's family, particularly her brother William, who had become Duke after their father's death, found more promise in aligning with Protestant rulers than with Catholic France. Despite this setback, the broken engagement did not tarnish Anne's value in the marriage market. Instead, it underscored her position as a diplomatic asset. She remained unmarried throughout her teens, an unusually long delay for a woman of her station, likely because her brother was waiting for the right match, one that would serve his religious and political ambitions. That match would soon come from across the Channel, in the person of King Henry VIII of England. By the late 1530s, Europe stood on uneasy ground. King Henry VIII had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church and was now seeking Protestant allies to strengthen England's position. Anne's brother, William, Duke of Jülich-Cleves, led a powerful Protestant territory in western Germany, and his unmarried sister Anne suddenly became a figure of great interest. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, urged the king to consider Anne as his fourth wife. The potential marriage would secure an alliance with the German Protestants and offer protection against Catholic threats from France and the Holy Roman Empire. But there was one problem: Henry had never seen Anne. To resolve this, Cromwell commissioned the renowned court painter Hans Holbein the Younger to travel to Germany and paint Anne's portrait. The artist was under strict orders. He was not to flatter her, but to capture her likeness as honestly as possible. When Holbein returned to England, he presented a painting that pleased Henry greatly. Based on this image and the alliance it promised, Henry agreed to marry Anne. The marriage treaty was signed in October of 1539, but the whole arrangement, including Holbein's portrait and Cromwell's assurances, was built on hope and high stakes. No one truly knew how Anne and Henry would get along in person. This was more than a marriage. It was a political gamble. For Anne, it meant leaving her homeland to become Queen of England. For Henry, it meant trusting art and diplomacy over instinct. As Anne prepared to journey to England, everyone waited to see if this carefully arranged match would blossom or crumble under the weight of royal expectation. In December of 1539, Anne of Cleves began the long and unfamiliar journey that would carry her from the German town of Dusseldorf to the heart of the English court. Her father had passed away the year before, so neither he nor her mother accompanied her. She traveled with a carefully chosen household and the weight of expectation on her shoulders. The voyage by land and sea was challenging, especially for a noblewoman who had never set foot outside her homeland. Anne passed through Cleves and then Antwerp, where she was received by English merchants. From there, she made her way to Calais and eventually Dover, arriving just days before her scheduled wedding. King Henry VIII, eager to see his bride, decided to surprise her. On New Year's Day of 1540, he met Anne in disguise at Rochester Abbey, hoping to recreate a scene of romantic courtly love. But the meeting did not go as planned. Anne, unaware of who he was, responded with polite confusion rather than the excitement Henry expected. She continued watching a bull baiting performance outside the window, barely acknowledging him. Deeply disappointed, Henry withdrew, and his enthusiasm for the marriage began to fade. Though Anne had not meant to offend, this first impression struck a blow from which the match never recovered. Still, the grand wedding preparations moved forward. Anne had come too far, and the alliance was too important to abandon. This initial meeting set the tone for what would become one of the most famously awkward royal unions in English history. The scene at Rochester Abbey on New Year's Day in the year 1540 would become a turning point in Anne of Cleves' life. King Henry VIII, following a tradition of romantic surprise, entered her room in disguise, hoping to charm her before formally revealing his identity. He approached her with a token in hand, a New Year's gift, and kissed her, expecting recognition or delight. But Anne, unfamiliar with such customs and not fluent in English, seemed confused. She responded with courtesy but little warmth, unaware that the man standing before her was the king himself. She soon returned her gaze to the courtyard, where bull baiting was underway, unintentionally dismissing Henry in front of his own courtiers. This encounter left Henry embarrassed and, worse, bitterly disappointed. According to those who witnessed the event, the king later lamented that Anne was nothing like what had been described. Though Holbein's portrait had pleased him, the real woman, he felt, lacked the charm and allure he had imagined. He complained to his advisors that he had been misled, and even suggested he would cancel the wedding if not for political consequences. Despite his misgivings, Henry met Anne formally a few days later at Blackheath, outside Greenwich Park. Publicly, the royal engagement was still intact. Privately, the king was already retreating from the marriage emotionally. For Anne, the disappointment was invisible. She had followed her duty, behaved with dignity, and trusted the process. But for Henry, this meeting had already cast a long shadow over their future as husband and wife. On the 6th of January in the year 1540, Anne of Cleves married King Henry VIII at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. The ceremony, performed by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, was a grand affair befitting a Queen of England. Anne wore a gown of rich gold fabric adorned with large pearls, styled in the fashion of her homeland. Her wedding ring bore the words, "God send me well to keep," an inscription that would prove strangely fitting. Despite the splendid ceremony, there was no joy in Henry's heart. He had already confided in his advisors that he found Anne physically unappealing and emotionally distant. Though the wedding proceeded out of political necessity, the king's displeasure was no secret behind closed doors. The wedding night was quiet and uneventful. Henry later told his physician that he had not consummated the marriage, and worse, that he found an even less desirable in private. Yet Anne seemed unaware of the king's growing dissatisfaction. She told the Countess of Rutland that Henry kissed her good night and good morning with kindness and affection. But when the Countess reminded her that more was expected of a royal union, Anne reportedly seemed puzzled. This early disconnect between Anne's simple contentment and Henry's disappointment defined their brief marriage. It was a union built on strategy, not affection, and it was already beginning to crumble. Though she had officially become Queen of England, Anne would never be crowned, and she would soon learn just how fragile royal favor could be. Though Anne of Cleves held the title of Queen, her marriage to Henry VIII was deeply troubled from the start. The king, who had once acted with urgency to secure the match, now openly regretted it. The spark he had hoped for never appeared, and worse, he felt repelled by Anne's presence in private. Their first nights together were marked not by passion, but by awkward distance. Henry confided to his chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, that he had not consummated the marriage. He insisted this was not due to any personal physical issue. In fact, he claimed to have had 2 dreams confirming his virility, but rather due to his complete lack of desire for Anne. According to his account, her body failed to please him, and he could not bring himself to engage as a husband. Anne, meanwhile, remained unaware of the true depth of the king's disappointment. She spoke kindly of him to the Countess of Rutland, describing how he kissed her and held her hand. But her words revealed innocence rather than intimacy, and the court began whispering that the queen did not understand what was expected of her. Behind the scenes, Henry began exploring options for escape. While the political stakes remained high, his dissatisfaction with the marriage made it clear that the union was doomed. For Anne, her position as queen was already becoming precarious, despite her public dignity. In the eyes of the king, their marriage was incomplete, not only emotionally but legally, and this fact would soon become the key to its unraveling. Anne of Cleves held the title of Queen of England for just over 6 months, from the 6th of January to the 12th of July in the year 1540. During this brief tenure, she fulfilled all the formal duties expected of a royal consort. She appeared at public events, dressed according to English fashion, and behaved with grace and modesty. But behind palace doors, her status was already slipping. Though she lived in royal quarters and received the respect due to a queen, Anne was never crowned. The lack of a coronation, often a celebratory affirmation of a queen's position, hinted at the king's hesitation and dissatisfaction. Henry's distaste for the marriage had hardened. He no longer tried to hide his discontent and frequently shared his complaints with those closest to him. As weeks passed, the royal court grew uneasy. Rumors spread about the king's failure to consummate the marriage and his doubts about Anne's virginity. Physicians were consulted, courtiers whispered, and Anne remained largely in the dark. She likely sensed the tension, but had no power to change her situation. In June, Anne was quietly ordered to leave the court and relocate to Richmond Palace. A few weeks later, she was informed that Henry intended to reconsider the marriage entirely. Despite being queen in name, her role had become symbolic rather than functional, a placeholder for a political alliance that no longer held value. Her time as queen was coming to an end, not through scandal or rebellion, but through a quiet, calculated shift in royal favor. By early July in the year 1540, Anne of Cleves was summoned to receive news that would forever change her status. King Henry VIII was seeking an annulment. The grounds were clear: the marriage had never been consummated, and Anne had previously been betrothed to another man, Francis of Lorraine. These claims, though politically convenient, were legally sufficient. Anne's reaction was measured and wise. Rather than protest or resist, she accepted the king's request with calm composure. This grace, in turn, earned her Henry's lasting respect. She signed the necessary documents and agreed that the union had not been valid in the eyes of the church or the crown. On the 12th of July, their marriage was officially annulled. This episode did not end without consequence for others. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match, became the scapegoat for Henry's displeasure. Once the king's most trusted advisor, Cromwell was arrested, charged with treason, and executed just days after the annulment was finalized. His downfall sent shockwaves through the court and marked the end of an era in Tudor politics. Anne, however, was rewarded for her submission. Henry granted her a generous settlement, lands, income and residences including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle. He also gave her the honorary title of the king's beloved sister, a unique designation that preserved her dignity and social rank. In choosing diplomacy over defiance, Anne secured something none of Henry's other wives had managed: peace, prosperity, and survival within the dangerous world of Tudor power. After her marriage to King Henry VIII was annulled, Anne of Cleves stepped into a rare and unexpected role, not as a discarded wife, but as the king's beloved sister. It was an honorary title, yet it carried real weight. She remained a member of the royal household, enjoyed high status at court, and retained wealth, properties, and influence that exceeded what most noblewomen could ever hope to attain. Anne lived with quiet dignity in England, a country she had once entered as a nervous bride. She adapted to her new identity with remarkable grace. Freed from the burden of being a royal consort, she now enjoyed independence without the danger that haunted many of Henry's other wives. Her settlement included several estates, such as Hever Castle and Richmond Palace. She maintained a generous household and was known for her kindness toward her servants and visitors. Courtiers often remarked on her gentle nature, refined manners, and dignified presence. Though she remained unmarried and did not live in seclusion, she was frequently invited to court and was given precedence over all women in England except the Queen and Henry's daughters. Even after Henry married again, first to Catherine Howard, then to Catherine Parr, Anne remained part of royal life, though always on the periphery. In private, she was content. She neither pressed for a return to power nor tried to reclaim her former role. Instead, she embraced her unique position, respected, independent, and safe. In a court full of danger, Anne of Cleves had managed the impossible. She had pleased the king by no longer being his wife, and she would outlive every one of his other queens. After Henry VIII's death in the year 1547, Anne of Cleves quietly adjusted to a new era. The young Edward VI took the throne, and Anne remained in England, living peacefully on her estates. Though she played no political role, she was treated with courtesy by the new regime, a sign of the lasting respect her conduct had earned. Anne's public reappearance came in 1553, when Mary I ascended the throne. Despite their differences in birth and background, Anne had always shown goodwill toward Mary, and the new queen returned that kindness. When Mary made her ceremonial journey to London, Anne rode beside her in the procession, along with Princess Elizabeth. It was a moment of rare visibility for a woman who had once ruled as queen but now held no official title. She also attended Mary's coronation at Westminster Abbey and even wrote the Queen a congratulatory letter upon her marriage to Philip of Spain. In these acts, Anne demonstrated loyalty, diplomacy, and a continued willingness to be part of England's royal life without demanding more than was offered. Anne once again adapted her religious practices, this time reverting to Catholicism under Mary's rule. It was a practical decision, not a statement of deep belief, one that ensured her continued acceptance at court. Her appearances, though respectful and dignified, became less frequent, but she remained as ever poised and proper, never grasping for influence, yet never forgotten. In an age where queens often rose and fell by the king's will, Anne stood as a steady figure of survival, grace, and enduring presence. Anne of Cleves had navigated the shifting tides of royal favor with skill, but even her careful diplomacy could not shield her from the dangers of Tudor politics forever. After Queen Mary's rise to the throne, Anne briefly returned to prominence, appearing in court ceremonies and public processions. Yet that return proved to be fleeting. In the year 1554, Anne's connection to Princess Elizabeth, who was seen as a rival by Mary's supporters, drew suspicion. According to the imperial ambassador Simon Renard, Anne was believed to have intrigued with the Duke of Cleves to obtain help for Elizabeth. There was no solid evidence, but the very whisper of conspiracy was enough to cost her royal favor. Anne was never again invited to court. With quiet dignity, Anne withdrew from public life and returned to her estates. She settled at Bletchingley and later at Chelsea, where she kept a modest but well-run household. Her life, once at the center of diplomatic strategy and royal spectacle, became private, measured, and still. Yet her generosity and warmth endured. Visitors and servants spoke of her as gracious, fair, and deeply humane. Trouble briefly returned when her brother William complained in 1556 that Anne's household staff, including a woman named Gertrude, had misled her with false stories and even spells. The matter was brought before the English council, and the offenders were removed. Through it all, Anne remained composed. Her withdrawal was not defeat but self-preservation. In a court that had destroyed so many, she had chosen peace over pride, and for that she had survived. Anne's life was no longer lived in the spotlight, but in quiet strength behind palace walls. In her final years, Anne of Cleves embraced a quiet life marked by stability dignity, and remarkable generosity. Though she no longer held a position at court, she was far from forgotten. From her residence at Chelsea Manor, once home to Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, Anne maintained a comfortable household and lived peacefully among a small circle of trusted servants. By the summer of 1557, Anne's health began to fail. She remained gracious and thoughtful, even as her strength declined. In the middle of July, she dictated her last will and testament. It reflected her kindness and gratitude, naming not only her close family members, including her brother William and sister-in-law, but also the young Princess Elizabeth, the Duchess of Suffolk, and the Countess of Arundel. She left monetary gifts and small treasures to her loyal servants, and even asked Queen Mary and Princess Elizabeth to find them employment in their own households. These gestures spoke to the deep affection she inspired among those who lived and worked with her. Anne was known as a fair employer, a skilled housekeeper, and a woman of gentle wisdom. Though once part of a grand political alliance, Anne's lasting legacy was built not on power or policy, but on grace. She was remembered for her calm spirit, her generous heart, and her rare ability to navigate the dangers of royal life without losing herself. Anne had arrived in England as a stranger, chosen for strategy, discarded for disappointment. Yet she lived on with respect, wealth, and peace. Her final years were not lived in loneliness, but in calm retreat, a quiet ending to a life that had once touched the throne. By the middle of July in the year 1557, Anne of Cleves had grown weak and weary. Her health had been in steady decline, and she now lived quietly at Chelsea Old Manor, a place once occupied by Catherine Parr. There, far from court politics and royal noise, Anne prepared for the end with quiet reflection and grace. On the 16th of July in the year 1557, Anne passed away at Chelsea Manor. She was either 41 or 42 years old, depending on which of her birth dates is accepted. Though the exact cause of death is uncertain, many believe she died of cancer. In those final days, she had already dictated her will, naming her brother William, her sister, and several members of the royal family, including Princess Elizabeth, among her beneficiaries. Anne's burial was handled with solemn honor. She was laid to rest on the 3rd of August in Westminster Abbey, one of the most sacred places in all of England. Her tomb, somewhat hidden and placed opposite the shrine of Edward the Confessor, carries a quiet dignity. The inscription upon it simply states her name, title, and the years of her birth and death, a fitting tribute to a woman who asked for little but earned much. She was the last of Henry VIII's 6 wives to die, and the only one buried in the abbey by her own request. Though her marriage had lasted just 6 months, Anne lived on for 17 more years, surviving political shifts, royal marriages, and dangerous intrigue. In the end, her legacy is one of quiet strength, endurance, and grace. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Catherine Howard was born around the year 1523 at Lambeth Palace in London, England, into the influential Howard family of Tudor England. What made this young woman rise from the shadows of a noble house to become Queen of England? How did a girl of charm and innocence get swept into the dangerous tides of royal desire and betrayal? And what doomed choices marked her path in a world where favor could vanish overnight? Catherine Howard was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard and Joyce Culpeper, and the niece of Thomas Howard, the powerful Duke of Norfolk. Her family lineage tied her directly to one of the most influential noble dynasties in England. But despite her lofty connections, Catherine's early life was marked by financial hardship and limited supervision. After her mother's death, she was sent to live in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. There, she joined a group of young aristocratic girls being raised with minimal formality but plenty of gossip, flirtation, and hidden games. It was in this lively, unsupervised environment that Catherine developed the beauty, charm, and confidence that would later catch the eye of the king himself. Yet behind her youthful laughter lay a dangerous innocence. With little guidance and much temptation, she began forming habits and relationships that would return to haunt her. Long before she wore the crown, Catherine Howard had already begun walking a tightrope between pleasure and peril, one that would carry her all the way to the royal court and into the heart of King Henry VIII. Catherine Howard spent most of her childhood in the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, at Lambeth. Sent there after the death of her mother, she was one among many young aristocratic girls raised in an environment that was more social than strict. The Duchess's household, though noble in name, lacked the disciplined structure expected of such a prestigious lineage. The girls shared sleeping quarters and were supervised only loosely. Music, dance, and laughter filled the halls, but so did whispered secrets and stolen glances. Education was basic, and moral instruction was inconsistent. Servants and musicians moved freely between rooms, and privacy was rare. For a girl like Catherine, curious, lively, and eager to please, it was a setting both exciting and perilous. In this environment, Catherine began to form early attachments. Her natural charm and pretty features made her popular among the young men and attendants in the household. Flirtations and secret exchanges were common. She quickly learned how to capture attention, but she lacked the deeper understanding of consequences that a more guarded upbringing might have taught her. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had high ambitions for the Howard name, but Catherine's early years were not closely monitored by him. Instead, she was left to navigate her own path, one filled with small thrills and hidden risks. These youthful experiences, seemingly harmless at the time, would later become central to the dramatic fall that awaited her. In the house of the Dowager Duchess, Catherine was not yet royal, but the seeds of her fate had already been sown in secrecy, in laughter, and in shadows. During her adolescent years at Lambeth, Catherine Howard experienced more than just noble instruction. She entered a hidden world of private encounters and unspoken rules. The relaxed atmosphere of the Dowager Duchess's household allowed space for youthful experimentation, but in Catherine's case, these early dalliances would return with devastating force. One of her earliest known attachments was with her music teacher, Henry VIII. He was older, worldly, and attentive, and Catherine, curious and flattered, responded to his advances. Their relationship, though initially dismissed as harmless flirtation, crossed boundaries. Letters were exchanged, promises were made, and familiarity grew beyond what was appropriate. When discovered, Manox was dismissed, but Catherine remained under no real reprimand. Not long after, she began a more serious relationship with Francis Derryham, a young man of courtly ambition and bold temperament. This was no passing flirtation. The two referred to each other as husband and wife in private and behaved accordingly. In the eyes of the church, such a precontract could be viewed as a binding engagement. Yet again, little was done to stop it. The Dowager Duchess remained unaware or willfully blind to much of this behavior. Supervision was loose, and the household continued to function with its usual gossip, giggles, and whispered meetings. For Catherine, these early affairs became lessons in secrecy, not in caution. What she never realized was that the court she would one day enter kept records of such things. In a world ruled by kings, confession was dangerous, and memory deadly. The past she thought forgotten would one day be unearthed, with fatal consequences. As Catherine Howard entered her teenage years, her life took a sharp and sudden turn. Thanks to her powerful uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, she was brought to court and placed as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves. It was a calculated move. The Howards had long used marriage, position, and charm to extend their influence. Catherine was now part of that strategy. Court life dazzled her. The gowns, the music, the dancing, and the endless stream of attention all fed into her youthful spirit. Catherine's beauty was undeniable: fair skin, a delicate frame, and a face that radiated innocence. She carried herself with a mix of playful charm and quiet ambition, which did not go unnoticed. Though her past remained tucked away in whispers, she presented herself as a perfect court lady, graceful, obedient, and seemingly untouched by scandal. This appearance, polished and pure, was exactly what her family needed her to project. And it was exactly what the king, now aging and dissatisfied in his marriage to Anne of Cleves, found irresistible. Catherine had little political education, but she understood people. She knew how to smile at the right moment, how to flatter with subtlety, and how to carry herself like someone destined for more. To those watching from the shadows, it seemed that the Howards were maneuvering once again, placing a rose before the lion. It was not yet clear how close Catherine would draw to the throne. But the stage was set, the court was watching, and Henry VIII had begun to notice the young woman in his queen's shadow. Catherine Howard's rise from lady-in-waiting to Queen of England was swift, stunning, and surrounded by whispers. King Henry VIII, now nearly 50 and nursing both physical pain and emotional frustration, found himself drawn to the youthful charm of this bright-eyed girl barely out of her teens. Where Anne of Cleves had failed to stir his passion, Catherine seemed to awaken it instantly. He called her his rose without a thorn, a poetic phrase that masked how deeply he had fallen. Catherine responded with careful warmth, not bold, not shy, but just enough to encourage the aging monarch's affections. Within months of Anne of Cleves's arrival, the king's interest shifted entirely to her young attendant. Henry's annulment from Anne was finalized in July of 1540. Just 19 days later, on the 28th of July, he married Catherine in a quiet ceremony at Oatlands Palace. The transformation was breathtaking. A girl raised in an informal household now sat beside the most powerful man in England as his wife and queen. But behind the joy and jewels, danger loomed. Catherine's past remained hidden from the king, and those who knew her secrets, like Francis Dereham, now watched from the shadows. Still, she wore her new title with pride. She danced often, dressed in fine silks, and gave generous gifts to her relatives. The Howard family, sensing victory, celebrated their triumph. To Henry, she was innocence reborn. To the court, she was a mystery. And to herself, Catherine was finally more than a girl in the background. She was queen. But even queens must tread carefully when their thrones are built on silence. Catherine Howard's wedding to King Henry VIII was not a grand state affair, but it glowed with the quiet joy of a private triumph. Held at Oatlands Palace on the 28th of July in the year 1540, the ceremony took place just days after the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled. Catherine, dressed in silk and diamonds, became the fifth queen of a monarch known for discarding wives as easily as changing clothes. For the king, it was a moment of renewal. He felt young again, energized by the presence of his new bride. For Catherine, the wedding was a dream realized, a leap from household ward to royal consort. The splendor of the palace, the treasures bestowed upon her, and the awe of those around her all confirmed what she may have once only dared to imagine. She threw herself into her role with cheerful enthusiasm. Catherine loved dancing, fashion, and courtly games. Her chambers were decorated with music and laughter, her gowns tailored to perfection. She was determined to be everything the king desired, youthful, adoring, and obedient. But her youth, once her greatest charm, was also her greatest vulnerability. While Henry saw her as a symbol of purity and grace, Catherine remained emotionally unprepared for the demands of queenship, and unready to fully sever ties with the flirtations and habits of her past. To those outside her circle, she seemed the picture of triumph. But beneath the jewels and titles, the fantasy of youth clouded her view of reality. She was now queen, yet still playing a dangerous game she didn't fully understand. As Queen of England, Catherine Howard embraced the outward performance of royalty with enthusiasm. She delighted in the elegant garments, the ceremonies, and the privileges that came with her new position. From the outside, she seemed to fit the role perfectly: young, vibrant, and always smiling. But being queen required more than charm and beauty. It demanded discipline, wisdom, and political caution, traits Catherine had never been taught to develop. King Henry VIII, aging and plagued by health issues, adored her. He showered her with gifts, praised her openly, and referred to her as his rose without a thorn. Catherine responded with warmth and devotion, fulfilling the expected role of the grateful young wife. She joined him in royal progress tours, hosted banquets, and made charitable donations to the poor, all gestures that enhanced her image as a kind and graceful queen. But while the public adored her and the court marveled at her radiance, Catherine was isolated behind the walls of the palace. She had few true allies and even fewer who would offer honest counsel. Her inner circle consisted of familiar faces from her past, some of whom still carried the weight of old secrets. Worse still, Catherine remained emotionally immature. She did not fully grasp the dangers of her position, nor the sharp eyes always watching her. She knew how to appear regal, but not how to survive the demands of power. In the golden halls of court, Catherine played her part to perfection. But the role was more fragile than she realized, and the expectations heavier than they seemed. Behind the polished surface of Catherine Howard's queenship, a quiet storm was gathering. Though she now wore the crown, old connections had not been severed, and dangerous new ones were beginning to take shape. The court buzzed with admiration for the youthful queen, but behind her chamber doors, secrecy once again became her companion. One of the most perilous threads was Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. Young, well-positioned, and confident, Culpeper was admired by many at court. Catherine found herself drawn to him in ways she never dared express openly. Whispers of secret meetings, past messages, and hidden favors began to stir among the queen's attendants. Whether out of reckless affection or emotional immaturity, Catherine seemed unable to resist the temptation. Compounding the danger was the re-emergence of Francis Dereham. The former lover from her time at Lambeth had boldly secured a place in her household, claiming familiarity and influence. Some say he blackmailed his way back into her orbit, using knowledge of their past relationship as leverage. Catherine, perhaps out of fear or guilt, allowed him close, a decision that would later tighten the noose around her. The Queen's household, filled with figures from her earlier life, became a network of secrets and suppressed truths. Letters were exchanged. Meetings were arranged, and all the while King Henry remained blissfully unaware, consumed by his love for Catherine and proud of his seemingly perfect match. But at the Tudor court, silence was never permanent. The walls had ears, and ambition had many servants. The Queen's private world, guarded by loyalty and innocence, was now exposed to unseen eyes and dangerous hearts. The return of Francis Dereham to Catherine Howard's life was not merely a personal matter. It was a spark that would ignite a scandal. Once her lover in the carefree days at Lambeth, Dereham resurfaced boldly during her queenship, seeking favor, position, and perhaps protection. His knowledge of their past relationship gave him dangerous leverage, and Catherine, now Queen of England, was in no position to deny him. She appointed him to a post within her household, an act that raised eyebrows among those who had long memories. To some, it seemed harmless. To others, it was a reckless misstep. Dereham carried with him letters, confidences, and memories of a time that Catherine could not afford to have revealed. Their relationship, which may have involved a spoken pre-contract, something dangerously close to a binding marriage, was now a liability of the highest order. Though she insisted the affair was in the past, the very presence of Dereham at court created unease. He was brash, confident, and boastful, and it wasn't long before rumors began to circulate. Servants whispered, and courtiers speculated. His arrogance suggested he believed he still held power over her. Catherine, meanwhile, lived in a growing state of anxiety. She had tried to distance herself emotionally, but the decision to include him in her inner circle only deepened her entanglement. The past was no longer behind her, it was now walking beside her, within the palace walls. In a world where secrets could be lethal, the reappearance of Francis Dereham marked the beginning of Catherine's unraveling, not through betrayal, but through memory given form. Among the many dangers that surrounded Catherine Howard, none proved more fateful than her growing bond with Thomas Culpeper. Handsome, ambitious, and favored by the king, Culpeper held a trusted position as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. He moved freely between the king's quarters and the queen's apartments, a rare privilege that he used to his advantage. Catherine and Culpeper's connection began in subtle glances and quiet exchanges. It soon deepened into secret meetings, often arranged with the help of Lady Rochford, the widow of Catherine's executed cousin, George Boleyn. In these midnight visits, words of longing and passion passed between them, though it remains uncertain whether their relationship ever became physical. What is known is that Catherine wrote him letters, expressing affection in words that revealed both emotional dependency and dangerous trust. One such letter, preserved as evidence, read, "It makes my heart die to think I cannot be always in your company." These were not the words of a cautious queen. They were the confessions of a young woman swept away by desire, unaware of how closely the court was beginning to watch her. Culpeper himself was no innocent. He had ambitions beyond service and knew the risks of entertaining the queen's affection. But flattered by her attention and enticed by the power she represented, he played along, perhaps hoping for more than just love. Together, they built a bridge between longing and recklessness, one that could not withstand the weight of Tudor scrutiny. Their secret world, once filled with whispered promises, now stood at the edge of exposure, and the fall would be steep. By late 1541, the sweet image of Catherine Howard as the king's cherished rose without a thorn had begun to wilt. Whispers drifted through the corridors of court, whispers of late-night meetings, of letters not meant for royal eyes, and of men who had once known the queen before her crown. The once carefree energy that surrounded her now felt tense, watched, and shadowed by suspicion. It began with John Lascelles, a reform-minded courtier whose sister had served in the Dowager Duchess's household. When she confided what she had seen and heard during Catherine's youth, particularly her relationship with Francis Dereham, Lascelles felt compelled to report it. His warning reached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who recognized the danger such knowledge posed to the throne. Cranmer chose a cautious path. Instead of confronting the Queen directly, he left a sealed note for King Henry to read in private during All Saints' Day Mass. The King's reaction was one of stunned disbelief. Catherine, his youthful bride, had seemed the embodiment of purity. The idea that she might be guilty of deception or worse, betrayal, crushed him. Suddenly, Catherine found herself under quiet surveillance. Her movements were monitored, her attendants questioned, and her letters intercepted. Those closest to her, including Lady Rochford, were caught in the tightening web. The Queen, once adored and untouchable, was now a prisoner in all but name. The royal court, with its golden thrones and jeweled halls, had become a cage. And as the whispers grew louder, Catherine Howard stood unknowingly at the edge of ruin. Once suspicion took root, the machinery of Tudor justice moved swiftly and without mercy. Investigators were appointed, and the Queen's household was pulled apart, layer by layer. What began as whispers now turned into full-scale interrogations, with servants, courtiers, and confidantes questioned one by one. The truth, or something close to it, began to surface, not in grand revelations, but in fragments of memory, frightened admissions, and letters pulled from hidden places. Francis Dereham was among the first to be arrested. He confirmed his past relationship with Catherine and claimed he had expected to marry her before she became queen. Though he denied any contact during her reign, his familiarity with her history was damning. When confronted with his own confessions, he attempted to shift blame, claiming that Thomas Culpeper had replaced him in Catherine's affections. Culpeper, too, was questioned under pressure. At first, he resisted. But when presented with Catherine's letters and Lady Rochford's cooperation, he confessed to private meetings with the Queen, though he insisted they had not been physical. The line between implication and evidence blurred, but for Henry VIII, betrayal or the mere possibility of it was enough. Catherine was not given the chance to defend herself publicly. She was placed under house arrest and stripped of her royal seal. Her pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears. Alone and terrified, she saw the walls closing in as those who once surrounded her now fled, confessed, or condemned. With each interrogation, the lies unraveled, and in the cold hands of Tudor justice, innocence was no shield, especially when worn by a fallen queen. Catherine Howard's arrest came not with shouting guards or iron chains, but with silence and formality. She was removed from Hampton Court Palace and placed under house arrest at Sion Abbey in Middlesex. The girl who once danced through the halls of the royal court now sat alone, cut off from her family, her attendants, and the man who had once called her his rose without a thorn. In her isolation, Catherine reportedly collapsed into fear and despair. She cried endlessly, begged for forgiveness, and pleaded for an audience with King Henry VIII, a request that was never granted. Whether she expected mercy or truly believed she could explain herself remains unknown. But the silence from the king was louder than any judgment. His pride had been wounded, and his heart, though once enchanted, had turned cold with fury. Meanwhile, those connected to her scandal met harsher fates. Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were imprisoned in the Tower of London, tried and sentenced to death. Their confessions, however incomplete, were enough to condemn them. Lady Rochford, who had helped arrange their meetings, fell under suspicion too, her own mind unraveling under pressure. Catherine, still a teenager, was left to confront her future alone. She had no powerful protectors left, and the Howard name, once a source of pride, became a mark of disgrace. The court that had celebrated her beauty and grace now whispered only of treason and betrayal. In those final weeks, stripped of title and surrounded by silence, Catherine faced not only the wrath of a betrayed king, but the heavy weight of choices made in innocence and remembered in judgment. The fall of Catherine Howard was not hers alone. It dragged down an entire branch of the powerful Howard family. As the scandal widened, the Tudor court turned its gaze from Catherine to those who had raised her, shielded her, and perhaps used her. The once celebrated noble house now stood accused of harboring secrets, of ambition over caution, and of placing a girl in the path of a king without ensuring her past was clean. Catherine herself was never granted a formal trial. As Queen of England, she might have been spared execution through legal defense, but her common birth and the overwhelming evidence removed such options. A bill of attainder was passed through Parliament, declaring her guilty of treason without the need for court proceedings. It was a swift, brutal process designed to silence dissent and satisfy royal fury. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were both executed in December of 1541. Dereham suffered the full horrors of a traitor's death, while Culpeper, perhaps due to royal favor or doubt, received the relative mercy of beheading. Lady Rochford was also sentenced to die, though her mental breakdown caused hesitation. Even so, an Act of Parliament was passed allowing the execution of the mentally ill, just to ensure her punishment. The Howard family, now disgraced, saw their fortunes crumble. Several members were imprisoned, lands were seized, and influence vanished overnight. Their dreams of dominance at court were destroyed alongside Catherine's crown. The message was clear. No one, not even those with the highest blood and favor, could survive the wrath of a betrayed monarch. And Catherine, once their brightest flower, had become the cause of their darkest fall. On the 13th of February in the year 1542, Catherine Howard was taken from her confinement at Sion Abbey to the Tower of London. She had just turned 18, a teenager once crowned Queen of England, now condemned to die by the man who had once adored her. The Tower, once a royal residence, now awaited her as a place of execution. Catherine was said to be terrified but composed. She asked for the block the night before her death, wishing to practice how to lay her head upon it. Some say she showed a dignity beyond her years, while others recall a girl paralyzed by fear, overwhelmed by the finality of her fate. On that morning she walked to the scaffold dressed in black, her face pale but resolute. In a soft voice she addressed the crowd, admitting her sins and asking for mercy upon her soul. Then, calmly and with quiet grace, she laid her head upon the block. With a single stroke, her life ended. Catherine Howard was buried near her cousin Anne Boleyn in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower. Like Anne, she had captivated a king, risen too fast, and paid the ultimate price. Their stories became haunting reflections of the perils faced by women in Henry VIII's court. Her legacy is one of tragic youth, of mistakes made in innocence, and of a court that devoured its own. Though often remembered as the queen who died for love or folly, Catherine's brief life remains a powerful reminder of how fragile favor could be in a world ruled by power, pride, and punishment. What do you think about Anne of Cleves? Was she a wise and gracious survivor? A woman who navigated the traps of Tudor politics with quiet strength and left the court with dignity and favor? Or a misunderstood outsider, used as a pawn in royal diplomacy, mocked for her appearance, and remembered more for a failed marriage than for her resilience? And what about Catherine Howard? Was she a vibrant young queen, full of life and light, who briefly brought joy to a weary king and left behind a haunting story of innocence and love? Or a tragic figure, too young, too unprepared, and ultimately destroyed by the very court that once celebrated her beauty and charm? Were these two women victims of their time, caught in a world where power shifted with whispers? Or were they quiet forces, each in her own way, shaping how history remembers the women who stood beside the crown? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if their stories touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more voices from history, voices of dignity, loss, and enduring legacy. Thank you so much for watching.